Hi, I'm Jane Gelch, State Manager for National Disability Services Queensland. Welcome to this organisational development session on leading through futures thinking. The National Disability Insurance Scheme is in progress across Australia, and here in Queensland we are getting ready for implementation from mid-2016. Implementation and the run-up to it will directly impact the future of service providers in the disability and other sectors. As service providers, we must be innovative and challenge our thinking if we are to be viable and remain sustainable. There is a need to create a new change story or narrative, a new way of viewing the future landscape for service provision. Futures thinking provides a useful and strategic framework and methods for both organisations and individuals to examine their assumptions. The assumptions we make are often hidden, yet are used every day to make choices. So, how do we create new narratives? This is where futures thinking may assist, as futures thinking challenges the very paradigms we use to make sense of our world, creating space for new ways of thinking or knowing what is familiar. Simply put, futures thinking provides a framework to get ahead of the change game and avoid adverse or undesirable futures. Ways to do futures thinking are varied. However, here at NDS we are examining, following and supporting the work of Professor Sohail Inayatullah and his 6 Pillars framework for futures thinking. Professor Inayatullah's work spans over 40 years in Australia and internationally and has been pivotal in creating new theories and practices that ground futures thinking in pragmatic application. His work will be familiar to many in Queensland as he holds a position at the University of the Sunshine Coast and has done innovative work with many sectors in Queensland. Recently we invited Professor Inayatullah to run a 3-day workshop to provide futures thinking education and capacity building for a range of NDS stakeholders. The workshop focused on how the practical application of the strategic foresight methods in futures thinking could work for us in the disability and the community services sector. This resource includes a guided interview with Sohail by futurist Steve Gould on basic futures theory and application of the 6 Pillars framework and methods. Being able to respond to reasonable and necessary support needs of people with disabilities will require all providers to consider how their own future will align with the preferred futures of people with disabilities. Futures thinking can provide a context within which to create the future we want, a framework and powerful methods that create real opportunities for real choices. I hope you enjoy this resource. I look forward to your feedback and to us creating our futures together.
Very simply, what is futures thinking?
Well, before we even ask that, I always set up futures as a learning journey. And what happens is the future is so overwhelming, so much data, Jetsons, technology, robots, and people get overwhelmed. So the way often people construct futures is things out there, new technologies. And I try to ask people, well, what do you do about all that? So one thing is, how do you react to the future? That's kind of basic, number one. What do I do differently?
Yeah.
The problem with that is we're reacting to the future. So futures thinking is saying, how am I living the future? Am I living someone else's dream? How do I reshape my future so it makes sense to me?
So that reaction could be a bit like feeling like we're on the back foot all the time.
Yeah.
When it comes to change.
Yeah. So I know with Gold Coast City Council, they asked me this question a few years ago, and they said they're busy. I said, as a city council, you're always going to be busy. Mm-hmm. Every organization is always busy. There's tons to do. The metaphor for me is the firefighter. Of course we need firefighters, but what % of the time are we doing prevention, thinking through what might cause tomorrow's fires?
My sense is that, and my history in planning suggested that a lot of the ways that these reactions were to have a plan. And
so planning is one way. We would say there's danger out there, uncertainty, let's set it up.
Yeah.
The problem with the plan, it assumes one future. Futures thinking is saying not to one future, but scenarios, multiple futures.
So by default, it could lock us into only a future.
Yeah. So future thinking is always saying, how is the future changing? For that to work, going back to my learning context, I have to ask myself, how is the world changing? Do I have the appropriate paradigm, worldview to handle that? So I was in Amsterdam a few weeks ago, and I was looking for a place to wash laundry. And everyone said it's right there in that square. And I kept on looking, and I couldn't find it because it was underground. So my framework was these stores should be above ground. So I didn't have the right paradigm or framework to see what I needed to see. So Foresight is going from what's my future, what are the alternative futures, to what do I need to change about how I see the world to have more choices, more possibility.
So then what I'm taking away from that message is one version of understanding and using the future or knowing the future can actually limit us in our ability to be quite adaptive with
That's
it.
exactly it. So one is adapting. Is my organization, am I more adaptable? But the deepest part of Foresight, again, is almost a cliche. If you want to predict the future, invent it.
Mm-hmm.
Now, to invent the future, you have to get clear on what are my assets? How do I use the future? In that sense, the future is not about new technologies. The future in itself becomes an asset. It becomes malleable. It becomes something I can play with. So transformation is using the future differently to create alternative and preferred futures.
So how can we use the future as an asset?
The idea of the future as an asset is a disruptive term. We normally think of labor as an asset, technology as an asset. In this way, seeing the future as an asset, it's an input into the world we wish for. It's an input into changing today. It's an input into questioning today. So the future for me becomes malleable. You can use it in different ways.
But how can I use something that doesn't exist?
The future always exists because it's an idea we already have. So the future could be, what's a different world we want? That's an asset. The future could be, hey, bad things could happen. Are we prepared for it? Contingency. So the future could be, what's my story? So I have a story about the way the world could be. It's a metaphor about the future. For example, is the future like rolling dice, randomness? Is the future like I'm on a train that's only going in one direction? Is the future like a jet plane? I can go anywhere.
How does then metaphors play a role here then?
Well, the crucial part is we're always living a story. So foresight, to me, defined is the understanding and shaping of alternative and preferred futures and the worldviews and metaphors that underlie them. So metaphor is always active in the future. What we try to do is, those in the futures field, is ask organizations, individuals, what's your own metaphor of the future? And now the challenge is there's no right or wrong metaphor. With one ministry I was working in, Ministry of Education, the metaphor they had of education was force feed. Now that may make sense in a command control perspective. We have knowledge, here's what students will learn. But the foresight argument is the world is shifting, new technologies, peer-to-peer revolutions. So students say, well, we don't want to be force-fed. So one way to handle that tug of war is say, what might be a different metaphor? So again, with this ministry, their alternative metaphor, well, actually, let's move to an a la carte system, where the student has more flexibility, more choice. But then some of the ministry said, well, if it's a la carte, they have full choice. We still are responsible for national curricula. So their third metaphor, which fit the culture, was the healthy buffet. So it won't be just, here's what you'll take. Well, here's 6, 7 alternatives, but we've done some research. Parents want this, teachers want this, the ministry wants this. So now we have a negotiated future called a healthy buffet. So if the future becomes an asset to change our paradigm, change our strategy.
You often hear the word transforming, transformational. How does that really link in terms of what you just describing around metaphor?
Well, traditional foresight was prediction. Tell us what will happen. So many CEOs, they want someone doing futures research to say, tell me consumer demand in 2020. What will the future client look like? How many people will be disabled in 2020?
So transforming was then understood as getting it right.
Yes. They didn't want transformation. The goal of foresight was to give accurate data on future supplier demand. Now, people doing it after a while said, well, as you go into the future in terms of time, you get a whole range of uncertainties. Will there be new types of disease, brain injury? How will space change? How will cities change? So then you start to think through, okay, it's not just getting it right, it's having scenarios. The transformation part is, okay, well, we have our scenarios, we have an alternatives, but that's not enough either. It's really inventing this alternative future. So transformation says, here's our data, here's our scenarios, here's how we're going to change our culture to come to our preferred future. So my hypothesis in transformation is, if we don't go the cultural deeper part, then culture eats strategy for breakfast. So in that sense, we want to find a new story that can help create the new future.
I suppose this, for me, the role of leadership then comes into conversation here, because I could then assume that transformation was necessarily the realm of the leader or the executive or the CEO. How do you see that shifting now?
See, that's dependent. Again, leadership used to be hierarchical, how to make the great man even greater. And that's climbed the mountaintop. The challenge to that has been, because of digital technologies, a general move towards peer-to-peer. So shift one was the leader climbing the mountain. Shift two was the leader enabling people so they could climb their own mountain. Shift three is cooperative, dispersed, distributive leadership. So the strategic foresight aspect of it is, okay, here's our new vision. How do we get there? Well, does leader just say, here's where we're going, or is it co-created? So the shift right now is more and more towards co-creation, because people want that. There was a fantastic new survey in one country, and the citizens were very clear. We want our leaders to set the vision, and we want leaders to enable, to create peer-to-peer democratic networks.
So this term, strategic foresight, my experience sometimes tells me that it gets misunderstood. So can you just expand a bit and define what we mean by strategic foresight?
Well, generally, foresight will be, how is the future changing? What's my role in it? What are the alternatives? The strategy part is, okay, given these alternatives, what might I do differently? So if there's going to be more risk in the future because of new technologies, climate change, and you're an insurer, how do you insure differently?
So when you say you mean more than just the leader of an organization, but rather everyone involved?
It could be. I mean, this is often the case. The data suggests it's more distributive, but it could be based on the metaphor of the organization. The organization might see themselves as a mountaintop. In that sense, it may make more sense to stay hierarchical.
So I want to bring you back now to this definition of strategic foresight.
Okay.
So let's go back there. In the simple terms, then, it could be defined as what?
So the foresight part is the creation of alternative and preferred futures with an understanding of the worldviews and metaphors that underlie them. The strategy part, once I've done the research, the workshop, the data gathering, what do we, whoever we is, do differently? So traditional strategy was, let's look at the problems and then we act. So again, one of my favorite stories is from my own professor, Jim Data in Hawaii. They ran a problem-solving workshop, and their conclusion was the biggest issue facing, in this case, the courts, was lack of parking spaces. Now that's important, but that's not critical.
Mm-hmm.
And so then he thought, wait a second, the way we're setting up this entire process is wrong. We should be thinking about how to solve tomorrow's problems today. Now for the leadership part, if I'm solving tomorrow's problems today, how do I get legitimacy for myself? How do I get credit? So then, of course, making it more democratic makes more sense. So as a group, we're anticipating tomorrow's problems. We're engaged in prevention to see, is the road we're on the right road? Do we need to shift roads?
I imagine that also would help with mitigation of risk as well, because you're
Exactly.
diffusing the analysis across all those in the organization.
Yeah. So traditional risk assessment was, okay, what might be the new technology, the financial risk? This is saying there's a worldview risk.
Right.
If in fact the way I see the world is a risk, how do I ensure robustness so I include other people in the act of thinking through futures?
So if I'm a leader, then it means making sure my own assumptions then are out there for as part of the analysis.
Yeah. I did a project for a board of directors in the veterinarian field. And they were thinking through the future of their organization. And what they quickly figured out, they asked themselves the question, who's not in the room? And who's not in the room, young vets weren't in the room. So if we're doing the vision for 2030 and our key stakeholders aren't there, then of course we're taking a huge worldview risk.
So that could be both in and outside the organisation.
Yes.
Who are
So,
part of that future.
So good futures research always asks the question, who's not in the room? Because they may have an answer, a framework that could be an asset.
So using the future as an asset, as an individual, evokes to me, in my own mind, the challenge of understanding my own change story and how do I assume, make sense of the future, but more importantly, what are those assumptions or stories that have shaped who I am today? So how successfully you have developed a very user-friendly and elegant framework in doing strategic foresight, so that I can start to think about how I could use foresight in my own change story. Can you expand and explain a bit that six-pillared method?
So the 6 pillars approach, the first pillar is mapping. And the idea of mapping, there's a method called futures triangle. It's basically saying what's your image of the future, what's the push. These are critical drivers, new technologies, demographics, aging of population, for example. What are the weights? What are the barriers preventing me? So that creates a contingent map. It's like if you're in a foreign city, you need a map to get around, right? Where are the roads? Where are the subways?
So in the case of the health services sector and the disability sectors, then they could understand the drivers of change, and predominantly some of those are very obvious, such as the National Disability Insurance Agency and the scheme itself.
Yeah, so that's pushing the future in a certain way. Then you ask yourself, what's stopping it? Is it bureaucracy? Is it an old model of leadership? Is it funding? Then you ask yourself, well, where do we want to go to? What do we want disability services to look like in 2025? So once you have a basic map, that gives you a sense of what the future could look like. But that's part one of the pillars. The second pillar is anticipation. That's saying what might disturb the map. What if robotics, we know we're moving more and more towards nursing care. Genomics, how might genomic intervention change disability? How might city design that's disabled person friendly? Whether roads or lighting, or in hospitals, we know there's so many causes of death is often the fall, because hospital design is not built for aging population. What if you had hospitals that had those soft floors? So you start to ask yourself, how might in the future, going out 10, 15 years, what might change?
Well, I suppose that to some degree that would then make it more explicit, some of those more dominant stories for the disability futures.
Well, the story part is not yet. I mean, this is really emerging issues analysis, is what are disruptors, new technologies, changes that challenge my map of the future. So once you've done that, now your map has shifted. It's like, oh my God, I never thought about that. So what one health insurance group, they were insuring illness. They started to think through, okay, given if there's personal genomics, if there's prevention, change in diet, people get healthier, are we in the right area? Should we now be thinking about becoming knowledge navigators?
For me, I think the anticipation is a crucial one, because it really does make explicit who's doing the anticipating, and more importantly, who's not in the room of the anticipation
And
process.
that's also important. So you get better information about the future the more people you include. So in one project on child safety, we asked the people in the room who were leading detectives, commissioners, are you getting advice from young people who may be vulnerable? They may have information or knowledge, or even a way of thinking, an insight that can help you make children more safer in the future. As it turns out, we had some of the leading police commissioners in the world say, yes, let me think about that. How do I get different types of information?
So pillar one, mapping,
Yes.
looking at what's creating our plausible future. Pillar two, anticipating
Yes.
what are those range of options. Can you expand then now to pillar three, timing?
Pillar 3 is timing the future. The notion there are there deeper patterns of the future. If you work in organizations, after a while, you start to see them.
So these patterns are like understanding change.
Understanding change. And we've noticed there's at least four are critical. One is the pendulum. So you see the organization shift, for example, between heavy centralization, heavy decentralization. You also see another pattern, linear. Linear is that every 5 years things get better, more funding, more resources. There's also cyclical, which is decline. And there's also spiral where you're transforming, going in the future, but some of the past stays with you. That's
So then, let me see if I'm getting this. In that, by understanding these patterns of change, somewhere now I need to think, well, where am I?
exactly. So if I know we've suddenly moved to a heavy centralization, then arguing for decentralization is not going to work.
So this then will influence in terms of my response to change.
Exactly. So you're not reacting. I now see the pattern in my organization, in my country, in my city. I can optimize my strategy for social change. If it's a linear movement up, then of course things will get much easier, much better. It's like a huge wave coming, and you can ride the wave. If, however, it's a downward cycle, then you think through, what should I do in a downward cycle? How do I get inspiration? How do I work with people when there'll be less funding, less resources, less assets
So
available?
if I can understand my own social model of change, what works for me, where I am in the pattern, and then potentially my responses, I can then sort of adapt to where I am in this pattern of change, and that makes sense to me.
And you may decide to fight against it, but
Okay.
at least I'm conscious of what's going on at a deeper level. So for example, you see waves where it's, if you look at the pendulum, there could be a period people are saying, let's do more research in genomics. In disability, we have to fix people who are disabled. Then the pendulum shifts. We don't need to fix anyone. It's really, how do we change society to make it more disabled person friendly? Redesign the city. And you see these patterns back and forth.
So in one sense, I could actually evoke my own leadership to influence the timing of the patterning.
Yeah. In that sense, if you're doing that, then I get the spiral. The spiral is saying, okay, I see this back and forth between, say, science and system change. How do I integrate both?
Or this policy versus that policy.
Yes. So that's wise fit. By knowing the timing pattern of the change, I can wisely influence the future.
Okay, so now it leads us onto the fourth pillar, the pillar of deepening. Now this is, I think, one of the most profound pillars, and the methods associated is called causal-aid analysis. Can you explain?
Causal-aid analysis simply suggests there's 4 levels of reality. The litany, the data, we see every day, headlines. Level 2 is the system, how we organize the data. You might say that's systemic change, society, technology, economy. Level 3 is worldview. Level 3 is the deep metaphor. So this suggests we have to work as activists, futurists, at all 4 levels.
So then in deepening my understanding of the future, really what you're saying is you're trying to deepen your understanding of the issues shaping
Yes.
the future, but also importantly the solutions.
Yeah. So in one fantastic workshop with National Disability Services, they said, well, let's look at how the big worldviews, the stakeholders see the future. So government might see itself as a gatekeeper. People who are activists may see themselves as, we have the right answer.
So these different stakeholders will have a different perspective on.
Yeah. Well, when we're doing causal-aid analysis, we want to see how do the different stakeholders see the future. For example, at one workshop at a university, when we did the analysis, the professor's core story was work from home. And then with the students, their main story was run away from parents. So the issue was, do we put money in building more student housing? From the view of academics, no. Money should be an infrastructure for broadband. From students, they want to grow up and get away from home. They want to move to campus. So scenario 1 would be, well, a university where there's students but no academics. So you start to think through, well, what's the wise way to use our funding, our infrastructure development, given these different perspectives. The mistake organizations make is they don't see how these multiple perspectives shape the future. They only see it from one view. CLA broadens the discourse.
So in the sense of, or in terms of the health services sector and the disability sectors, that would mean taking considerations of those different stakeholders, being parents and families, the person with disabilities, the bureaucrat, the private enterprise.
Yes.
There's a range here, isn't it?
There was one brilliant conference, 2005. It was a 2-3 day conference, and we started to think through what are the solutions using CLA as a framework. So something that became very powerful, we had someone who said, right now I'm known as Julie, the blind person, on apartment 3.
Yeah.
And in her new story, I would want to be known as just Julie. Now that's the story, but the story must be matched with systemic change. So that means how do we redesign buildings, apartments, cities? So it's both. It's changing the deep story, but also changing system design.
So Julie then brings an alternative scenario.
Yes.
So then leads us now onto pillar 5, which is creating alternatives so that we honour the Julie stories. And so pillar 5 is really about creating alternative futures through methods of scenarios.
Yes. There's multiple techniques. There's 2 I'll mention right now.
Yeah.
One is, if I'm in an organization, an easy way to go forward is say, what's our best case? Then we might ask, well, what's our worst case if we don't change? And we might say, what's business as usual if things continue going on the next 20 years? And then from emerging issues analysis, we say, what's the outlier?
So really what we're doing in scenarios is locating uncertainty with a degree of certainty in scenarios.
Yeah, you want to say, there's so much going out there, let's manage the information. And the reason why that works is most people are used to only one future.
Oh.
So if I say multiple futures, they slightly freak. I say, well, no, we can contour this. Best case, worst case, business as usual, outlier. The other reason it works is, say you're an organization that doesn't want to shift. Then you say to them, well, look, if we do nothing, what happens in 10, 15 years? People say, oh my God, we'll be behind the 8 ball. Okay, how about if we totally do nothing and bad things happen? Well, it's worst case. And then you ask, what's the best case? So it gets people to shift their cognitive framework.
So I suppose the benefit of having then these scenarios developed is also they would then honour and reflect some of the different stakeholder perspectives, the different framing of the issues and potentially solutions around the different futures. So it sort of creates this space for renegotiating then what is the ultimate preferred or desired future.
Well, that moves then from pillar 5 to pillar 6, which is transformation. So pillar 5 looks at alternatives, and you ask the stakeholders in each different future, what does your life look like? In the best case, worst case, business as usual, outlier. Then they get a sense, here's what it will mean. Pillar 6, transforming and saying, what do you wish the future to be authentically be like? So we had one mayor in a city, we were trying to make the case why change was important. So the comment was, okay, if you do nothing, given current demographic trends, crime trends, what would your city look like? They said, well, it'll be unsafe. It won't be person-friendly. It won't be community-friendly. We said, okay, now let's imagine your preferred future. It was very clear. Less cars, more greenery, organic gardens, rooftop gardens, a building design that basically honors the individual in the community. So people wanted to do that. So first it's important to figure out then, where do you wish to be like? What does 2025 look like? So transformation is getting very clear. Yes, risk assessment, looking at alternatives, but truly the question is, what's my desired future?
So this is really then is pulling together and creating this alignment of all stakeholders towards this preferred future.
It could, you could do it for your family, your own life. For an organization, of course, all stakeholders. For disability services, yes, everyone in the field. Here's where we wish to go. Now, sometimes there's disagreement and you honor that disagreement.
How? How did you do
Well,
that?
you can see, well, here's one group's preferred future, here's the second group. You could look for win-win stuff. So in one city, one group wanted this incredible green city.
So I don't have to capitulate to the dominant preferred.
No,
We
you
can
can have a
actually hold-
negotiation. And the other group said, no, we want heavy urbanization, we want glamour. And finally, after we negotiated the futures, the glamour group said, well, the reality is we won't have glamour if there's sea rise. The city will disappear. And the green people said, well, green is a great ideology, it's a value system, but if we don't connect with people and make it fun and exciting and doable, people won't change. So we found a way to negotiate the preferred.
I suppose I just want to reiterate this point then, though, it's not then the preferred future singular, but preferred futures plural.
It can be. Again, it's dependent.
Okay.
So with one organization, they wanted to know what's our preferred future, and then we worked with everyone there to come up with a shared future. Now, often what happens when you do the preferred vision, there's a loss of hope. And I asked groups why. I said, we've imagined 2025, we're not sure we can get there. So the transformation technique is backcasting. It's a simple question. You're in 2025, what happened the last 10, 11 years? Don't give me a ton of data, give me a map of the past. So often, you don't have to change everything. You have to figure out what are 3 things that need to shift from now to the future. So you don't want to overwhelm people. You want to find, in our capacity, our zone of control, what needs to shift. So the backcasting gives a powerful way to come with a strategic foresight plan.
So initially these simple steps towards our preferred is helping us then to realise the desired changes we want.
Yeah.
And it can be as simple as just taking one project or one action
Yes.
towards that preferred.
Yeah.
And it doesn't have to be complex, but the benefit could be that we're actually then engaging in foresight.
The benefit is two. One is there's a sense of, okay, cynicism. It may not happen. What if it doesn't happen? Skepticism. It will never happen. So you want to engage people in heart, head, body to say what needs to be done.
But even that would be a scenario.
Well, see, that's not a scenario. That's a capacity part. Here's our vision. Here's how we got there. The act of then doing the action learning gets people involved in changing. So then the crucial part for me as the metaphor is the path is the goal. So the pathway creates the goal. And to do that, you have the vision. And as you start on that, the vision becomes real by doing something
I
different.
suppose the point I was making about, if you come across those who say it's not possible, whatever,
Yes.
part of them is actually bringing in the risk mitigation along the pathway.
Okay, no, your point is brilliant. So the scenario becomes, here's why it won't work. You said, yeah, okay, right.
So
Our
we need to
preferred
be-
future is this. Worst case, it doesn't work.
Yeah.
And then you mitigate.
Yes.
Okay, tell me in your worst case scenario why it won't work. They say, well, we'll lose funding by 2018. We won't get the award by 2022. Okay, great. So two things we need to do very clearly. Get the funding, have a system of measurement that incentivizes it. Exactly.
So
Fantastic.
bringing in these voices is,
Yes.
once again, using them as an asset, as you said before,
Yeah.
in creating the
Yeah.
desired future.
So again, people want leadership to be visionary and truly participatory. Both have to work.
So if we think then of success, using strategic foresight as a means to creating success and where we ought to go as a preferred future, are there any critical success factors that we need to be sensitive to?
Well, I would first thing, I would challenge the default future. If we do
What
nothing.
do you mean by default?
Default is if I do nothing. If I continue unconsciously into the future, what's going to happen? Do I wish to change it? We know certain diets, certain patterns of behavior don't lead to the preferred future. So first, challenge the default. Now, once you challenge the default and there's change, people go to the use future.
What do you mean by that?
Well, use future is something we keep on doing over and over, even though the data science tells us it's not going to work. It's kind of the comfort zone.
It's a bit like, it sounds like borrowing from something.
It could be, like, for example, we know in policing, best policing behavior is you look at where the areas of crime and you put your resources there. The old policing use future is, well, let's have the police car drive around.
So I would need to be a little bit sensitive to who I listen to about who's telling the answer of what is the future.
Well, the success factor is asking, is this used or is this innovative? If I'm designing new pedagogy or schools, I would ask myself, you bring in a new technology, but kids are still in a row. Is the design used or is it innovative?
So is the policy solution more the same?
Yes.
Goes back to the timing and the pattern, understanding that.
So one is default, challenge the default. Second, challenge the use. Third is look for emerging issues. What's changing the world?
So this is where we bring in the pillar of forecasting methods.
Yeah, the anticipation.
Yeah.
So I need to always be looking at the weak signals, the disruptors, so I'm aware of how the world is shifting. The fourth one is alternatives. Don't think of one future, think of many. The scenarios. I know we worked with doctors many years ago. Their scenario one was corporatization. I said, what's the second scenario? Well, scenario two could be listening to the patient, what's called back to values. Scenario three was basically doctors disappear, technology takes over, tricorders, etc. Then I said, well, what's another one? And the fourth one became the multi-door health center, which brought in multiple perspectives. So by going outside one, they got many.
What I'd like to do now is to go through the tips and learnings that we can do as becoming a practitioner in applying strategic foresight methods. Now, my understanding is the best way to get people primed and ready to do these methods is to consider doing the foundational questions first.
Yes, I will do that first. I ask groups, individuals, organizations, first, what's your research question? Futures of Health 2025.
So when you say research question, you mean the topic they're going
The
to explore?
topic, yeah. And then we set up, there's 7 questions. If my question is, again, what will health look like in 2025? Question 1, what's the history of your question? Question 2, if current trends continue, what will it look like? Question 3, assumptions. 4, alternative futures. 5, preferred. 6, the backcast, how did we get there? 7th, is there a supportive story? So these questions prime people, they get them going, they have to have tough questions around assumptions, and they get to articulate their preferred futures.
Now, I know myself in using these as a priming sort of process. I've done a pre the workshop and post, or within the workshop, right at the beginning. And to some degree, I think their value is they give us a sort of a line in the sand where our thinking is.
Yes.
Is that what you mean?
Yeah, and you can test it. What I say is, well, the methods may be a bit difficult. Go out and try the 7 questions with your staff, with your friends. Run them through it. Make it real.
With your family.
With your family. Do an action learning project.
Okay, what I'd like to do now is to help prepare someone to move into using this as a leader or as a practitioner or as a manager. How can I start developing my foresight practice?
Well, I would start with mapping.
Okay.
So you've done the questions, now you ask yourself, use the futures triangle. It has 3 parts. What is the preferred image of the future? What does it look like? What is the characteristics? 1. Second, what are the drivers pushing towards there? Third, what are the weights? That gives you a great map of the future. Futures triangle is easy, everyone can do it. The pushes are quantitative, the pull is visual, and the weights tend to be qualitative.
Okay, so really then the foundational questions can actually help populate the futures triangle. Or make sense of
Yes,
that
brilliant.
part.
Yeah.
Okay, wonderful. So let me see, I'm facilitating a workshop.
Yeah.
I get people around the room, we clarify what the research topic is we're
Yes.
going to explore, and then we give people some paper and creatively they go and work out what is the push, pull and weights of that subject.
Then I have them act it out sometimes.
So now it comes to the reporting side.
Yeah.
So that
They may do a skit, they may do an interview. 1 or 2 people could be the weight. 1 person could be the push. Third person could be the image. So then they might do a little drama or a skit, some way to embody it.
One of the things I've noticed in workshops is that there's this strong sense to have a balanced triangle, but it's rarely ever balanced, is it?
No. Some places the weights may be more. We did one workshop on person-centered healthcare. And the image was beautiful,
Yes.
focused on the patient, focused on the person, on the community. The pushes where we've seen quality and safety and health increase once we do that model. The weight is senior hospital administrators may agree, but that means giving up power to patients. That means for oncologists or surgeons to give up a bit of expertise. So the weight may be very heavy there. The push is brilliant, the data makes sense, the pull is brilliant, the push makes sense, but there is a real weight. So it could be skewed. Solving climate change. We can see a sustainable future, we know the pushes, but there's still weight around the industrial era.
The way we've been behaving as society.
Exactly.
So that leads then, are there some questions we could ask as a facilitator to critique or analyse or synthesise the results from the triangle?
Well, I would say, given the triangle, what are the key messages? Do you find a way to lighten the weights? Or do you decide there's a huge wave of pushes coming on, let me write it? Or you decide no one actually gets where we're going. We need to make the vision compelling. We need to tell a better story.
Or our vision is no longer relevant, or
Yes.
maybe we don't have one.
Yeah.
Okay, so it's very easy then you can start to decide where you intervene,
Yes.
where you may build strategy around to
Yes.
address some of the more discerning or concerning issues of which push, pull, or weights.
And there may be messages that you can decide, here's the message that needs to be communicated to all our staff or stakeholders.
Now, one of the other questions that's come up for me by participants who've done the futures triangle is they notice then there's a range of images.
Yes.
Images become more explicit, but they tend to compare and contrast.
There's 2 ways to do it. One is to say, what is my preferred image? What's my preferred future? You get one type of triangle. The second is, what are the competing images? Sustainability versus industrial versus a high-tech, robotic, artificial intelligence future.
Because I've had another practitioner say to me, but Steve, is the futures triangle, when we ask for the pools, really about trying to get our forecasts or our desired or preferences?
You could do it, it's 2 different ways.
So
Just
it
be
doesn't
clear how you're going to use it.
Okay, so you need to be clear whether it's
Yeah.
forecasts or preferences
Yes.
as images.
Yes.
I also noticed then it does make for a rich discussion when you start seeing the competing images.
Yes.
And for each of those images, there's a weight and
Yes.
a
Yeah.
push.
If your preferred future is more industrialization, what's the weight? The weight is climate change. The weight is pollution. The weight is silos. The weight is young people not wanting that future. The push may be money.
So foundational questions prime us to be able to do the first mapping of our plausible
You
future.
start the 6 pillars process.
That might bring some insight in terms of what is our foresight approach, what's our capacity in foresight, or what are our limitations.
Brilliant.
So can you tell us now a bit more on the second method of mapping?
That's really the future's landscape. And we ask individuals to say, okay, the landscape is the jungle, the chess set, the mountaintops, the emergent future, and the vision. So where are you spending your time? Is your organization totally in the jungle? Very quick time, scarcity?
So in other words, my responses to the future are very about survival, not very...
Survival based. And the chess set is strategy. The mountaintops is crucial. Are we looking at the big picture? And then there's the emergent future, what actually emerges, and all the time saying, okay, where will we be in 2030? That's the vision. So you want to be able to understand where you are in the landscape, and do you have a landscape?
And by understanding where you are in the landscape, what does that mean, potentially?
Well, you could decide, well, we're spending too much time in the jungle. How come we've not done a visioning part? How come we've not done scenarios?
Or our foresight is very short term,
Exactly.
not really long term.
Yeah.
Or not a combination of both.
Or some groups, they're all the time in the vision, and they don't have anything about data, reality.
So they're not really grounded in pragmatism and trying to make
Yeah.
alignment between vision and
No
action.
strategy. Always in the clouds, no strategy. Futures landscape is almost an auditing tool.
So the key message then in understanding where you are in the landscape helps you to adapt where you may be able to expand your foresight
Brilliant.
approaches.
Yes.
Okay. So the pillar of mapping, 2 key methods supported by the foundational questions.
Yes.
It leads us to then get a very robust sense of where we are now, where we've come from, but more importantly, where we're going, all things considered.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you for expanding on the 2 methods on the pillar of mapping.
Yeah.
Let's look at the pillar of anticipation and the pillar of timing. These are 2 very important pillars. So firstly, anticipation. 2 key methods, futures, emerging issues analysis. What is that?
Emerging issues analysis is what is invented by Graham Walter. It's a simple S-curve. On the right-hand side, here's the problems. We usually focus on the problems. The middle are the trends, where there's some quantitative data. Emerging issues says, let's focus on the bottom of the S-curve. These are highly unlikely, but high impact events that could change the trajectory of where we're going.
So this is really changing that analysis around the pushes, which could be
Yes.
very much associated with the problem top,
Yes. Yeah.
which holds our focus
Yeah.
in the present.
So emerging issues are weak signals. So
So-
they're things that you can hear but not quite hear, but they could be quite dramatic. You need to be on top of it.
So they would obviously potentially have influence and significant shift if they are occurring.
Yeah. So for example, 3D printing. What if every home had a 3D printer?
Yeah, it's a good example.
Or 3D printing of pizza, a 3D printer in your kitchen? Or what if we went from the hierarchy model to the peer-to-peer model? What if there was dramatic climate change where sea level goes up by a meter in Sydney in 2050?
So the intention then of the emerging issues method is really then to try and map on how these signals are travelling through time.
Well, there's 2. One intention is to say what's changing, and how do I need to be alert to it?
So this type of analysis done in the emerging issue really is about trying to extend our sense of foresight around both not only the present but also the future.
Yeah, you're extending the horizons. Normal frameworks are horizon 1, what's happening today. Horizon 2 goes out further. This is horizon 3 thinking, 10, 15, 20 years. Clearly every house today won't have a 3D printer, but perhaps by 2025 it could happen. What do I need to do in an organization to make use of that, or if I don't want it, to prevent it?
Yes, because I can imagine that most of our focus when it comes to issue analysis keeps us very much located in the present and very sort of in the now, so to speak.
So as one trucking company, what happens if everyone has a 3D printer? So then we use the futures wheel. We take the emerging issue and we, on a flip chart, put the issue in the middle. And then we look at first and second order implications. So if every house has a 3D printer, possibility one is, well, trucking goes out of business because everything is being done in-house. That means manufacturing gets hit. What are the implications of that? But someone says, wait a second, 3D printers will still need ingredients. Or we're the ones who ship the 3D printers. That's another alternative. So we're asking, if something occurs, what might happen, what might happen, what might happen?
So I would imagine if I'm facilitating this method that it'd be easy to identify the problems at the top of the S-curve.
Yeah.
Not so hard. I imagine it would be harder to try and find those emerging issues because if there are any weak signals, how do I recognize them?
One is you want to always be looking at tons of articles in the newspaper, magazines, the web, saying what's new, what isn't new. That's one idea. Second, there's a whole range of fantastic web services that do that service for you. They present you, here's the latest in robotics, here's the latest in caring, here's the new data on demographics.
So to add some robustness to this analysis, I could bring in some environmental scanning results and then try and make sense of it through the emerging issues analysis.
So if you were a scientist looking at biosecurity, you'd have a network of people doing scanning, looking for what are the potential new zoonotic diseases that could go from animal to human.
So there's some pre-work potentially that would add to this process, but also I can use the subjectivity of who are the opinions in the room at the time and their intelligence.
So they could be scanning all the time, or you could have a one-day retreat every year and ask managers, experts, your stakeholders, what's different, what's disruptive coming the next 10, 15 years.
Have you observed any adverse reactions to this method from participants?
No, people like it. People enjoy thinking, what's next?
See, I have a story where I've seen
tell me.
where leaders actually get really nervous by this method because potentially there's a lot of benefit to them by solving complex problems.
That's true too.
Creates great following. But if I try to mitigate and solve problems before they've emerged, how do I play that role?
I do my best to ensure if you've done the earlier parts, we're here to solve tomorrow's problems today. Now certainly in the process you do get people getting very upset because say suddenly you decide you're insuring, for example, trucks,
Yes.
and now you're moving to a situation, well, we're not going to do that. We're going to actually create new bioinformation systems to monitor the truck driver so we have safer futures. Now the person in charge of the insurance part suddenly sees, oh my God, this emerging issue is changing the game.
Yes.
So whatever the example is, those vested to the used future will find it difficult. So the pre-work to make sure everyone's on site, we're going to challenge the established future, we're going to go in different directions.
So in one sense, clues and cues come from emerging issues to be able to think of alternatives and adaptations.
Yes, definitely.
Okay, wonderful. So emerging issues analysis helps us sort of get ahead of that change process.
Yes.
Alrighty-o. Second method, futures wheel. My understanding is it's really about trying to take a topical issue that is of great concern or focus or interest and then trying to extend our sense of foresight of the consequences.
Yes.
Is this
First and second order consequences, as the example with 3D printing. If we have 3D printers, what are the implications? What are the implications?
So this method actually really stimulates or pokes our incentive or motivations for doing foresight work.
The challenge with the futures wheel is most people can figure out the first order. So if there's aging population, we know, of course, there'll be more old people.
Right.
Now, what are the implications of that? That's what we have to figure out. Does it mean change in city design, hospital design? Or does it mean change in school system design, ensuring that retired principals have a way to mentor? Does it mean generational wars? So the future wheel starts to map out the implications of a particular emerging issue, aging, for example, or 3D printers, or climate change.
So in some sense, what we're doing again is extending our sense of foresight of what the future may, expanding it and expanding it, and that potentially we can make some reasonable assumptions and forecasts based on this type.
It would change your strategy then. For example, if there's
creates
3D,
choice.
if there's artificial meat or 3D printers producing food, and you're in the agriculture industry, oh my God, what might it do to agriculture?
Mm-hmm.
Do we stay the current trajectory, or do we create a niche, or do we create a niche market? What do we do differently?
So this is almost like trying to understand the ripple of change.
Yes, beautiful, beautiful.
So which then takes me to then the pillar of
I like that
timing.
ripple of change. It's like you throw a rock
Yes,
in a lake.
that's the issue.
Where does the ripple go?
Ah.
So that's beautiful. It's a great way. That's a great way to think of it.
And I suppose then, linking now to the pillar of timing, we spoke earlier about this in the introduction, about it understanding patterns and patterns in change. So the ripple is a pattern.
Yes. When we look at timing, I try to keep it quite focused. I say generally our research suggests there's about 4 patterns. There's linear going upwards, cyclical going downwards, pendulum back and forth, and spiral, which has linear plus the past as well. So I ask groups, okay, in your organization, what things are going upwards? Do you think the future will be brighter? Another group would say, what things are cyclical, going downwards? A third could ask, what are the pendulums of my organization? Is it centralization, decentralization, science, or society?
So what I'm hearing here is that once people make sense of an emerging issue or an issue through a futures wheel or as a ripple of consequences, then I'm understanding where that might be in a pattern of change.
Yes.
There's a series of questions I need to ask as a facilitator
Yeah.
to be able to make sense or try and interpret what are these implications or consequences.
Yeah, the patterning leads to better insight. What is the deeper pattern in my organization, my country, the planet?
And where am I within that?
Yes, exactly. Or where is my organization or institution or country? And these patterns change over time. In Asia, the pattern 30, 40 years ago tended to be cyclical, rise and fall. If you go to East Asia now, the pattern is very clear, linear.
So these
More production, more wealth, people living longer, the future is very bright.
create space then for alternative thinking, these methods.
Well, the timing, what it does, it gives you insight into the trajectory, and then you can ask, well, my God, we're going downwards. What do we do differently?
So this is not space, it's more about choice.
It's choice.
Ah.
Where is choice? And that leads, of course, to the 4th pillar, deepening, which is what's my metaphor of choice?
Which we'll talk about in the next session.
Yes.
So, any takeaway or key messages you want to leave with the
Well,
participants?
with mapping the future, see it as a map. Use the futures triangle. What's pulling, what's pushing, what's the weight? With anticipating, always ask yourself, what are the emerging issues? What's new? Right now, emerging issue is a wealthy, unified Africa.
What are the risks if I do nothing?
That's even better. And the third takeaway with the timing of the future is what is the shape of the future in my organization, in my own life? Do I need to change anything?
Tell us, what's the purpose of deepening our understanding of the future?
I use deepening as a way to find out what's stopping successful strategy. So more and more, I've done this for the last few decades, I find there's often a story, a metaphor, a mythology that's stopping us from realizing where we wish to go. So causal-alert analysis is a theory of knowledge, a methodology to help us get more robust solutions that work.
So the main method is causal-alert
Yes,
analysis
CLA,
here.
yeah.
And causal-alert analysis was developed by yourself?
Yes,
Over many years, I
Yes.
understand.
through Foresight workshops, through action learning.
So actually this method stands on a lot of those previous, or the scholarship of futures.
Yes.
And then also how we understand the layers of knowledge and knowing.
Yeah, there's four layers. The litany, which is the visible future, the headlines.
Yep.
The system, incentives, fines, the worldview, the perspectives, and the deep myth. All 4 are required for transformation.
I think I get very excited by this method because for me, then what I'm starting to realize is that those earlier pillars and those methods don't necessarily get into that critiquing of assumptions and beliefs.
Yeah.
But this method does.
Yeah. And I'll give you an example. I was working in one country looking at their transport futures. And I said, why are you doing this? You're already ranked as among the best integrated transport solutions in the world. They said, yes, that's 2014. We've done a trend analysis which suggests by 2025 we'll have major congestion. So we need to today start to look at alternatives. So one alternative they started to look at is, what would it look like if we used our waterways more? So the question we asked was, what would happen if we used more waterways? So we started to look at that, and then what amazingly came out was waterways would be successful, but the current metaphor of waterways is castaway. They're not important. This was in Asia, and Asians don't want to be seen if they're successfully upwardly mobile on little boats. So there's a story around use of boats.
So walk us through that as you go down the layers.
Yeah,
that
so
example.
level one was, okay, should we use waterways more? And then it was, what's the current system? Well, the current system is we're using roads and fines and
So this is
highways.
level 2.
Yeah. Level 3 is, which is the dominant mode of transport, which is cars.
Yeah.
And then we asked ourselves, okay, so basically it's a car road worldview. Then we said, well, what would it look like if we used waterways? So systemically, what would need to change?
So there's obviously many stakeholders involved in this analysis if we're running a workshop.
Yeah.
So do different stakeholders bring different perspectives as they go through this
Well,
method?
in this case, this was really for the transport group.
Yeah.
It was just phase one of it. So then we asked ourselves, systemically, what would it look like if you designed a transport system that was waterways friendly? How would you have boats? Who would get licenses? How would it link to trains?
So you're getting the group to do
Level
each
2
level
analysis, yes.
collectively.
Yes. So
Rather
level
than-
1 was by 2030, 2025, here's the percent of citizens using waterways. Level 2 is, how do we incentivize it? How do we link to other modes of transport? Level 3 was basically the waterway is a worldview. Here's how we see it. Now level 4 was the crucial part because the metaphor currently is castaway. So then they redid it to say, okay, what would it look like if we're using it effectively?
So the first one really is a take of understanding current reality.
Yes, yeah.
And then the second time you go through it is really layering the solution.
Yes. And they
Okay.
came away that the layer, the solution metaphor is casting widely.
So the solution has all 4 layers in it.
Yes.
Great.
And then you might say, well, if you did it with stakeholders, you would say, well, how would a citizen feel about it?
So now you're talking about using CLA method differently rather than just unpacking an issue in current reality and alternative to now doing it by stakeholders.
Yeah, yeah.
So, is there many ways you can use
Yeah,
this?
well, one way is deeper causation. Why are there medical errors in the health system? So then you say, well, it's because of doctors making mistakes. That's level 1. Or is it systemic, hospital design, bad handwriting, drugs that haven't been tested? Or is it level 3, the worldview of the expert system in medicine where doctors are above, patients are low? Or is the story, doctor's always right? Then you say, okay, that's our current unpacking. What might be a different way? So the new story could be, I'm an expert about my body. The worldview is patient-centered. The system is, well, it's doctor plus patient having knowledge about his or her health care. And then we say, what would be the new measurement? So you could unpack it, and you could say, what might it look like differently from a different view?
So then this is really, in my sense, what you're saying is that you're using multiple stakeholder perspectives, same context, same issue,
Yep.
but then trying to negotiate a solution, a layered solution through these multiple perspectives by stakeholder.
Yeah. So when we did this with the disability services, we found out that the current reality, the story people were saying from their view, was they see disabled persons as damaged goods. And so that has to be transformed. But you have to say, here's the current metaphor, and we measure it in certain ways, and the system is not disabled friendly. So what might be a new story?
So when you say what might be the new story, I would imagine then it's crucial to have be discerningly aware of who's in the room and who's not in the room.
Definitely, definitely. You want a dialogue about metaphors,
So
a
we're
dialogue
gonna need
about
the department
strategy.
in the room. We're going to need
Yes.
the parents, the person with disability,
Yeah.
the service providers. So we're going to need a range of these key stakeholders to do this type of analysis.
Yes, and start simple.
What do you mean?
Well, with the example I used on waterways, we said let's meet with the transport experts first. Let's come up with our new strategies, our new solutions, our new metaphors. Then we might do a stakeholder workshop with citizens. How do they see water? We collect the data. Then we come to a multi-pronged integrated strategy. So it's step by step. But first do the analysis, then test it out.
So first do it by. So if I was facilitating this method,
Yeah.
I would then have my group go through a topic,
Yes.
and that's what you mean by first do the simpler version of analysis.
Yeah.
So listening to what you're saying, Sohail, my sense of learning from using this method would be that it's about trying to keep it simple initially, bringing as many people and their perspectives into the analysis, but more importantly, making sure that everyone starts to bring and make explicit their assumptions, beliefs around the issues.
I would say more than beliefs, I would say what is their core metaphor?
So this is going below beliefs,
Yeah.
the metaphor again.
So in one project on the education revolution, they were exploring why hasn't more and more computers being given in classrooms led to some type of transformation. At the systemic level, we found out that many of the computers weren't being used. They didn't have service contracts. People couldn't figure them out. They're being put away in closets. But as we explored deeper, the number one issue for principals were their story was, I'm in control. So the new computers changed the focus, the loci of who has power. So we had to help them let go of that story. Well, many people can be in control. We're all learners versus you're only the boss.
So this sort of makes explicit where power hides in each of those levels.
Yes. And also then, so if you can figure it out, you can see, well, how, because the goal is to be successful in strategy, to make sure the service gets delivered.
Yep.
So this is what's preventing it. Is it we're measuring the wrong thing? Is it systemic? We've organized incentives and disincentives wrong. Is it we've not included many worldviews? Or is it that our metaphor is not supporting our strategy?
So coming back then to just very quickly measuring, if solutions are layered from all the four levels, could we build evaluation and measures on those?
Exactly. I always ask for implementation. Does your new implementation strategy have a new story?
So that would be at the metaphor level.
Yes. Are you ensuring that there's deep stakeholder involvement?
So that's the cultural side.
Yeah. What are the incentives you've pushed in to make sure the system responds? If there's no incentives, people won't do it.
So a new policy would be measurement of that at the systemic level?
Well, then litany would be, what's my new measurement?
Okay.
What's visible?
Yeah.
So I ask for implementation, all four levels being engaged with.
I'd imagine one of the consequences of using this method would be that you're creating inclusion in co-creation of a future design.
Definitely. Yeah.
Okay, beautiful. Any other key messages you want to share on causal layout analysis?
Test it out. I mean, many people understand level 1 and 2. Here's the visible, here's the data, here's the system. Often we forget, we could have worldview blindness, and often we forget the power of metaphor. And often, CLA, by engaging in multiple stakeholders, as I said earlier, democratizes metaphor or mythology.
I remember a colleague, Lisa Fraser, once saying that when we're doing workshops around Queensland, the question we're asking was, does my future match my story?
Yes.
And I think CLA is a great way to find out and answer that question.
You can apply CLA to your own life. How do I measure my own success?
So does my story match my image of my own future?
Are my systems I put into place, regulations about my own behavior, are they useful? Does my own story support where I wish to go? If not, what do I change?
This can be quite confronting a little bit.
It's confronting for those who don't believe they have a story, because this unpacks any particular worldview. So if you have a worldview that you own the truth, then it might be confronting, because this suggests you may believe you have the truth, but that may be just a metaphor.
So this really brings out and makes it us to come to this awareness that there are multiple ways of seeing the same phenomena.
Yeah. I'm okay if they say they have their own truth. I'm just asking them, does that position serve you? If it's serving you, maybe it's okay. If you're finding by you saying that you have your own truth or believing that prevents success, that prevents negotiation, then it may not help.
Okay, so this could help them critique that.
Yeah, and it's unpacking. And if you can find out what's the real story around my organization, then it makes sense. We had one group where they couldn't figure out why the 3 big cities in Australia were competing with each other. Then once we did the CLA, they said, oh my God, we're actually organized as an empire. And these are 3 kingdoms fighting. Mm-hmm. Then they figured out, so I'm basically the king here.
So the real transformational part is when you explore the worldview and the narrative.
I find that very powerful.
And that's where transformation comes from.
But once then I've shifted story or metaphor, then it can't just be talk. I need to then ensure that systems are incentivized and measurements that match my story.
That's the pragmatism of locating it into a policy response or a procedural response and measuring that accordingly.
So all 4 are needed.
Okay. Any takeaway messages?
I think that's it. Make sure you use all four, make sure story matches where you're going, and be prepared to ask myself, yourself, what's my own narrative?
Beautiful. Thank you, Sohail. Pillar of creating alternatives. The core method here is scenario development. In essence, scenarios are for what purpose?
Well, people use scenarios for different reasons. One, it could be contingency. Let's be ready for a disaster or something bad. What will it look like? Second, it could be for opportunity. What are some different possibilities? Third, in conflict resolution. You see many people fighting because they assume there's only one future. You see that with kids. If you say, well, okay, you're fighting over that toy, what are some alternative futures? You could share the toy. The parent could throw it away. You could buy new toys. You could take turns. It's to get people to think immediately in every situation, what are the alternatives?
So this is really about a range of choices.
Range of choices and great way to manage risk.
How does it link then to the earlier methods we've been speaking in the earlier pillars, such as the futures triangle or CLA?
Well, this manages the depth of information, this manages the width of information. Scenarios capture a different part of reality. So there's 2 or 3 very good techniques. The one I use is called the integrated. That we ask first, what's your preferred scenario? So one group said we want a green, ecological, gender partnership city.
Which could have come out of a poll on the futures triangle.
It could have, exactly. Then we ask what's disowned. The disowned future is what people are unable to see, the other worldview. And the other worldview that came out was, well, we're not talking about power or money. Then the integrated is, okay, how do we make sure a green city has the ability to be financially viable? So those 3 emerge by asking question 1, you're preferred, you're disowned, and you're integrated. And the 4th part of that is, what's the outlier? What's the unknown? That comes from emerging issues analysis.
So this is more about stepping outside of what we don't know a little bit.
Yes. Now the other scenario technique is what's called organizational. What's the best case? What's the worst case? What's business as usual? Again, what's the outlier? All are meant to do the same thing. I'm going on a particular path. Let me open it up. Let me look at options. Let me be future flexible. So one, it's a methodology, but it's also a way of thinking. Always asking, what's the alternative? What's the alternative?
So the transformational component here is really then holding these different potential futures in awareness and in our consciousness.
Yeah. You may still choose, here's where you wish to go, but one, you looked at the options. But scenarios are more than options. Each scenario is a lived possible world. So we do something called incasting. What's the visible characteristic of that?
So this is the structure of the
scenario. So we could use CLA. What's the litany? What's the system? What's the dominant worldview? What's the story? And I always ask, what's a day in the life of that person? Because I want it lived. So if I ask the CEO or a worker or someone in the organization, what does your day look like?
So as I come up with these different alternatives, whether by different participants within the workshop, the different results that have come out of the earlier methods, we can actually populate these different scenarios and hold them as all equally legitimate futures.
That's crucial. Because the mistake everyone wants to is tell us a likelihood.
So this is almost like the forecast certainty.
Yes, and we're saying, well, in fact, you want to have different futures so it's more robust. And you don't want to get trapped into this will be likely. It may look likely today, but imagine if 5 years of new technology or economic issues. Suddenly what was likely 5 years ago looks very unlikely today. So it's really authentic alternatives.
Have you got any examples or case studies where people have not necessarily done scenarios before doing some of the more deepening work method like CLA?
Well, then they have scenarios, but they don't have the power of transformation.
What do you mean?
Well, they don't tell the story. They don't have a metaphor what it looks like. So it's just 4 different alternatives, but no one buys into it. They can't see themselves in that future.
Is that a bit of an intellectualizing?
Yeah, I think it's a technical construct which may be useful for the scenario writer, but it doesn't capture the imagination of the public, your board of directors, and people who will be influenced by it. Scenarios are meant to be deeper engagement. They're not just meant to be artificial
Or
constructs.
technocratic.
No, no.
So, in essence, what I'm hearing is that the pillar of creating alternatives is very much leveraging off the earlier pillars, which really challenge our story and our
Yes.
worldviews.
Yeah.
And to do it prior to that might be a little bit, leave us only at the systemic or the
Yes.
litany.
What
solution.
happens is if you start with scenarios without doing emerging issues analysis or futures triangle or CLA,
Yeah.
you get scenarios based on today, and they're very safe.
So then that just gets carried into the future.
Yeah, so it's based on today's drivers. Here's what will emerge. If you use the other methods, you get pushed into breadth and deepened.
One of the things that sort of has stood out for me in my involvement with different stakeholders in the health and community services sector, and specifically my colleagues in the National Disability Service and the Workforce Council, is that there's a real strong sense of this work in disability futures is ethical and there's meaning, and that foresight in recognising that there is a need to create different futures is part of this ethic. Can you sort of talk a little bit around why foresight work is ethical and meaningful?
For me, if you're looking at many alternatives and you want to say each one is possible, the uncomfortable issue is, well, what's right? Now, I frame that into what's your preferred future?
Okay.
Where do you wish to go? And that's essentially the sixth pillar of futures, transforming the future. The sixth pillar for me is, what's your ideal future? Where do you want to go?
So the ethic and the meaning of this work is really getting that alignment.
Yeah,
to
getting
that
clear.
preferred.
Where do we wish to go? Is it the right place? Do we want to go there? But it's also moving from where we are today. So the preferred future, that's the transformation part. Here's where we're going. And of course, you would want to think through the story preferred is, does your story match where you're going?
I suppose that leads me to then expanding a little bit on the last pillar, the pillar and the method associated with the pillar of transforming, visioning.
Yeah.
Um,
So the way you do visioning is, one, there's personal visioning through creative visualization. That's when I ask groups to close their eyes, you go on a walk to a hedge, then you look at your preferred future.
so we can put a script up on a slide on this.
Yeah, so we can say, here's our preferred future.
Okay.
So that's one way. And then we get a message from the future that tells us, how did we do? The second visioning is really interviews where two people question each other in a very quick way to find out where do they wish to be in
That
2025.
would be what we've really been doing today.
Well, it's much quicker. You straight away say, it's 2025, what are you doing?
Okay.
And you don't let them actually edit. So you
Ah.
want to get the quick response, and they
So
tell
top
you,
of mind.
top of mind, right? Because if you have them edit, then their voice of cynicism, it can't be done, comes out. You want to get through really what do they want. So the preferred future is really saying, let's not worry so much about the ground. Where do we want to go? What's our ideal
So
future?
it can be a little bit clunky and doesn't have to be perfect.
Yeah,
but
yeah. In an organization, you may have different sets of values or preferred futures. And then you start to negotiate, well, what's the core part?
So this is renegotiating the values around those futures.
Well, you may negotiate, or it could be straight away, here are 6 characteristics of a desired future.
Wow.
If you're doing this personally, you can say, okay, here's where I wish to be in 2025. The crucial part is asking yourself, where do you wish to be? And imagining it and making it feel real. You're feeling your way to the future.
So that feeling then would obviously connect with what is ethical, what is meaningful,
I think what it's...
emotive response.
Yeah, the ethical part to me is personal.
Ah.
Because remember, we're deconstructing the notion of what's ethical. Because ethics may change in the future.
True.
So I'm hanging it on where you wish to go, not in some pre-given, here's the way the world should be.
So strategic foresight really is about renegotiating
Meanings.
meanings and the
Meanings,
official.
purposes, directions, and you have to have good methods to do that. Otherwise, it just becomes a random conversation about the future.
So, as a facilitator using these methods through the 6 pillars, is there any key messages or tips that you would have for facilitators?
Once you're doing the visioning part and they get excited about the new future, then there's a loss of energy sometimes.
Yes.
And you have to say, okay, if you're in 2025, here's what it looks like. You do backcasting. We talked about that earlier. If 2025, here's your ideal future, now you're not doing strategic planning. You're remembering the past. What happened in 2024, 2022, 2020? So you're getting some key milestones looking at the past from the future. So that takes away the cynicism, it won't happen. Because now it's happened, you're just remembering it and using that memory to create strategy.
So 2 key methods in the pillar of transforming. Visioning, and there's 2 ways you just suggested which you can do that. But then from visioning, we backcast, bringing the future to the present, which creates that sense of pragmatism and realism, what I can do tomorrow.
Yeah. I mean, with one city council, we did the visioning and everyone started to get excited and then they got depressed. And I said, why? They said, well, we actually don't think we can achieve the vision. So then we did the backcasting. I said, okay, you've already achieved it. What happened differently the last 15 years? As they went through that, they realized they don't have to do everything. That gets overwhelming. So it became, what are the 3 pivotal things that need to shift? Then you focus on those 3. So once you've done that, then you might ask yourself, what's next? I mean, Steve, you work on implementation all the time. How would you answer that? What's next? What's missing? What do we do afterwards?
That's a very good question. And for me, I think futures work and strategic foresight is always about grounding it in pragmatism, and so that I can do something tomorrow in creating that preferred. That's the ethic and meaning for me. And I think that's what makes it real to people, foresight work. Well, this series has been...
Can I comment on that?
Yeah, sure.
I agree and disagree. I like the pragmatism, but the whole nature of foresight is to challenge pragmatism. To actually also be idealistic. Because if you're too pragmatic, I reinforce the present as it is now.
So I get to use future.
You get to use future, the disowned future, default future.
So,
but if you're too idealistic, then it doesn't touch people's reality and they give up. Now, what's happening now, the world is shifting dramatically. So people can see a new future emerging. The end of hierarchical world to a flat world, but then they see a flat world, but we still have the old hierarchies. So we're living in a world of tension right now. Different futures, different possibilities, and those tensions are what make day-to-day life difficult for organizations and persons. Future says, let's get clear on the vision, let's look at the tensions, and find ways to actually resolve those tensions.
So finding ways is then what you're saying, and with implementation is the action learning experiments.
Yeah, I mean action learning is out of say the vision, or you do the backcast. Here's 3 things we need to do. Let's experiment. Do a prototype. Let's try it. Then you come back later and think, okay, we tried this questioning process. We did the scenario process. We did the visioning process. What's our big takeaway?
You mean as in learning?
Yeah. And how do we do it again? If it's just a workshop, there needs to be something real that happens afterwards that gets fed back in. And then for me, that goes from an organization as a structure function to an organization as a learning ecology.
I think one of the other criticisms I want to address here is that sometimes foresight work has been labelled as more than just one-off events, and that actually should be a sequence of a learning that we come back and revisit and adapt through those learnings and insights.
I mean, it's creating the adaptable learning, futures-oriented organization or person. It doesn't stop. But that doesn't mean it should be overwhelming. There are day-to-day things we have to do. So it could mean just once a year everyone meets to look at emerging issues.
So that learning is really about how we adapt to be able to navigate those tensions and reduce the lag between the preferred and current realities.
Exactly. That's beautifully said. Strategic foresight is reducing the lag between the preferred future and today's reality.